The curved walls of Classroom 7 Delta aboard Kepler Station gleamed under soft blue lights. The room was designed to make different alien species comfortable, with special seats and air systems for each type of being. Professor Xylith stood at the front of the room, her crystal-like skin catching the light like a prism. She was an Altarian, one of the oldest and wisest species in the galaxy. The morning class was full of young aliens from many different worlds. Crick sat in the front row, her insect-like body covered in shiny black plates that showed she was still young for a Vrakari. Next to her sat Whisper of Leaves, a plant person whose bark-like skin made soft rustling sounds when she moved. In the back of the room, 3 Netherian students floated in special glass suits filled with gas. Since their bodies were made of living clouds, other students filled the remaining seats. There were rock-like beings from the mineral worlds, water creatures in mobile tanks, and several species that looked almost normal except for their strange colors or extra limbs. All of them were the best students from their home planets, sent to learn at the most famous school in the galaxy. Professor Xylith looked at her class with serious eyes. She had taught thousands of students over the years, but today's lesson was different. Today she would tell them something that would change how they saw the world forever. "Students, please take your seats and prepare your recording devices," she said in her musical voice. All Altarians spoke in a way that sounded like singing. Today we begin a very special lesson. It is called Advanced Historical Analysis, and it covers events from 300 years ago. The students looked at each other with excitement. Advanced? Classes were rare and usually very interesting. They dealt with the most important events in galactic history. "Before we start, I must warn you," Professor Xylith continued. "This lesson might upset you. You might learn things that go against what you have always believed. The school only allows older students to take this class because younger minds might not be ready for what they will hear." Crix's antennae twitched with curiosity. What could be so shocking that only senior students could learn about it? Her people, the Vrakari, were known for being brave and facing hard truths. She was ready for whatever the professor had to teach. "The events I will tell you about happened in the year 2157, Professor Xylith said, as she touched controls on her desk. The lights in the room grew dim, and suddenly a huge 3-dimensional map appeared in the air above their heads. It showed hundreds of star systems, each one glowing like a tiny sun. This was our galaxy 3 centuries ago. Nearly 1,000 worlds were part of the Galactic Council. Trade ships moved between planets every day. Different species worked together in peace. Medical science was so good that most diseases were just bad memories. The students stared at the beautiful star map. They could see their own home systems glowing among the others. Everything looked perfect and peaceful. But then something terrible happened, the professor said, and her voice became sad. Something that almost destroyed every thinking being in the galaxy. As she spoke, the star map began to change. One by one, the bright stars started to dim and turn red. It started with just a few systems on the outer edge of the galaxy, but the red color began to spread like blood in water. A sickness appeared that no one had ever seen before. We called it the Silent Death because of how it killed. It attacked the brain and nervous system of almost every intelligent species. People would start to lose their ability to think clearly. They could not speak or remember things. Then they would die very quietly, without making any sound at all. Whisper of Leaves shivered, her bark making worried rustling noises. The red markers on the map were spreading faster now, covering more and more star systems. Some of them were close to her home world. The Silent Death spread faster than our fastest ships, Professor Xylith continued. It jumped from world to world in ways that our best scientists could not understand. Entire planets would be healthy one day and completely silent the next. Billions of people died in just a few weeks. Crix watched in horror as the map showed her people's homeworlds turning red. She had never heard about any plague in her history classes. Her teachers had told her about wars and natural disasters, but never about a sickness that killed entire planets. One of the Netherian students spoke up, their voice sounding like wind through their gas-filled suit. "Professor, if this plague was so deadly, how are we here? My family records go back to that time period, but no one ever mentioned a plague." Several other students nodded and made sounds of agreement. They all had ancestors who lived during 2157, but none of their families had ever told them about the silent death. Professor Xylith looked at her students with eyes full of sadness. That is exactly the right question to ask, Harmony of Depths. Your ancestors should have died. According to all the science of that time, every red world on this map should have become empty and lifeless. But you are here, which means someone or something saved them. She paused and looked at each student carefully. What I am about to tell you will shock you. The beings who saved your ancestors, who prevented the end of galactic civilization itself, were not the wise council members or the advanced species with their amazing technology. The star map zoomed in on a small, unremarkable yellow star in a quiet corner of the galaxy. The salvation came from here, from the third planet of this system, from a species so primitive and backward that most council members did not even consider them worth noticing. The image focused on a small blue and green world. From Earth. From humanity. The classroom fell completely silent. Every student stared at the small blue planet floating in the holographic display. Humanity. The species that everyone made jokes about. The ones with the old broken-down ships and primitive technology. How could they have possibly saved anyone? Professor Xylith touched her controls again, and new images appeared in the air. These were old recordings from the plague years, grainy, and unclear because the technology back then was not very good. The students watched in growing fear as they saw what the silent death had really done to their ancestors. The first video showed a Vrakari hive city. Normally, these places were full of noise and activity, as thousands of insect people worked together like a giant family. But in the recording, the city was eerily quiet. Vrakari workers had simply stopped in the middle of their daily tasks. Some had fallen down where they stood. Others sat motionless, staring at nothing with empty eyes. Crix felt sick as she watched, her own people dying. Her antennae drooped with sadness. "Professor, why did no one ever tell us about this?" she asked in a small voice. "Keep watching, young Crix. You will understand soon enough," Professor Xylith replied gently. The next recording showed Whisper of Leaves' homeworld. The great forest cities of the Sylvani were famous throughout the galaxy for their beauty and wisdom. The tree people lived in harmony, sharing thoughts and feelings through root networks that connected entire continents. But in the plague footage, the forests were silent and still. The great trees that housed the Sylvani communities were turning brown and lifeless. Without the thinking minds to keep them alive, the forest cities were dying. Whisper of Leaves made a sound like wind through dead leaves. She had never imagined that her beautiful homeworld had once been so close to complete destruction. The recordings continued, showing world after world falling to the silent death. The gas worlds of the Netherians, where millions of cloud beings floated through colorful skies, became empty and gray. The crystal cities of the Altarians stopped singing their ancient songs. Even the mighty rock people of the mineral worlds, who everyone thought were too tough to be hurt by anything, crumbled to dust when the plague reached their nervous systems. Our best doctors and scientists worked day and night to find a cure, Professor Xylith explained as the students watched footage of advanced medical facilities. We had quantum computers that could process millions of calculations per second. We had bioscanners that could look inside living cells. We had genetic engineers who could rebuild DNA strand by strand. The medical footage showed gleaming laboratories filled with incredible technology. Robots performed surgeries with perfect precision. Holographic displays showed complex molecular structures. Everything looked far more advanced than anything humans had ever built. But none of it worked, the professor continued. The silent death was unlike anything we had ever seen. It seemed to target the very things that made each species intelligent and special. The smarter a species was, the faster they died. New images appeared showing the Galactic Council's response to the crisis. Massive warships surrounded infected planets, their weapons pointed not at enemy fleets, but at the dying worlds below. The Council made a difficult decision, Professor Xylith said, her voice becoming cold and official sounding. They declared all infected worlds to be biological hazards. Military blockades were put in place to prevent any ships from entering or leaving plague zones. Crix's mandibles clicked with confusion. But Professor, if people were dying, why did they stop ships from helping? The Council's computer models showed that the plague would spread to healthy worlds if any contact was allowed, the professor explained. Their calculations said that if they could contain the infected areas for 6 months, the plague would burn itself out. Everyone on the quarantined worlds would die, but the rest of the galaxy would be saved. The students watched in horror as the blockade ships fired warning shots at medical vessels trying to reach plague worlds. Even ships carrying food and medicine were turned away or destroyed. The message was clear. No one was allowed in or out of the infected zones, no matter what. The Council called it acceptable losses for the greater good, Professor Xylith said. They calculated that losing a few hundred worlds was better than losing the entire galaxy. One of the rock-being students spoke up, his voice rumbling like an earthquake. Professor, the Council was right to protect healthy worlds. It was logical. Yes, Stoneheart, it was very logical, the professor agreed. The Council species were known for their intelligence and careful thinking. They made the smart choice based on all available information. She paused and looked around the room at her students' faces. Some looked confused, others looked sad, and a few looked angry about the hard choices their leaders had made long ago. But there was one species that did not make the logical choice, Professor Xylith continued. One species that ignored the Council's orders, broke through the military blockades and flew directly into the plague zones to help dying strangers. The star map appeared again, zooming in on the small blue world called Earth. Humanity received news of the plague through independent traders. Their response was so shocking, so completely illogical, that it surprised everyone in the galaxy, the professor said. While advanced civilizations used mathematics and careful planning to decide who should live and who should die, humans did something much simpler. She smiled for the first time during the lesson. They decided that everyone deserved to be saved. The holographic display changed to show Earth as it looked 300 years ago. The planet appeared small and unremarkable compared to the grand crystal cities and gas worlds the students knew from their own homes. Earth's cities were built with simple metal and concrete, and their technology looked like ancient toys compared to modern galactic standards. In 2157, humans had only learned to travel between stars 57 years earlier, Professor Xylith explained. Their ships were powered by basic fusion engines that other species had stopped using centuries before. The Galactic Council had rejected humanity's applications to join 4 separate times. The official reason was always the same: technological and cultural inadequacy. The students watched footage of human spacecraft from that time period. The ships looked rough and patched together, held in place with welded metal plates and what humans called emergency repairs. Next to the sleek vessels of other species, human ships looked like flying scrap heaps. Most council members barely knew humans existed, the professor continued. Those who did know about them thought of humans as amusing primitives who would probably destroy themselves within a few generations. No one expected them to play any role in galactic affairs. New footage appeared showing the moment when news of the silent death plague reached Earth. The recording was from a human news broadcast, with a woman speaking into a primitive camera while words scrolled across the bottom of the screen. The human reaction was immediate and completely unexpected, Professor Xylith said. Within 6 hours of receiving the first plague reports, human medical organizations began organizing relief missions. Within 12 hours, the first human ships were being loaded with supplies and volunteers. The students watched as humans rushed around spaceports, loading medical equipment and supplies onto their old ships. The equipment looked laughably basic, compared to what advanced species used. Instead of quantum scanners, humans packed simple devices that had to be held in their hands. Instead of automated surgery systems, they brought basic tools and medicines in metal boxes. But Professor, interrupted Whisper of Leaves, her bark rustling with confusion, humans knew about the quarantine, right? They must have known the Council had forbidden anyone from entering the plague zones. Oh yes, they knew, Professor Xylith replied. The Council sent official warnings to all known species, including humanity. The message was very clear. Any ship attempting to enter quarantine space would be destroyed without warning. The display showed the official council message as it appeared on human communication systems. The warning was written in multiple languages and marked with symbols that meant extreme danger and forbidden by law. The human governments received this message and immediately sent their own warnings to human medical organizations, the professor continued. They told their people not to attempt any rescue missions because it would be suicide and would risk starting a war with the council. Crix clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. So humans stayed away like everyone else? Professor Xylith's crystal features seemed to glow brighter. Not exactly, young Crix. The human governments told their people to stay home. But humans, as we would learn, do not always listen to their governments when they think something more important is at stake. New footage appeared, showing human ships leaving Earth's orbit despite the official warnings. The ships were marked with red crosses, an ancient human symbol that meant medical help. They flew in small groups, taking different routes to avoid council patrol ships. Captain Lee Min-ho of the medical vessel New Seoul was the first human to reach a quarantined system, the professor narrated. When council battleships surrounded his ship and ordered him to leave, his response was recorded for history. An audio recording played through the classroom speakers. The voice was male, speaking in accented Galactic common, with a tone that sounded both respectful and completely stubborn. Council Command, this is Captain Lee of the human medical ship New Seoul. We understand your quarantine orders, but people are dying in there. We are doctors and nurses. We came to help the sick. You can shoot us if you want, but we are not turning around. The students sat in amazed silence. A human captain had threatened council warships, ships that could destroy his vessel with a single shot. The council commanders did not know what to do, Professor Xylith continued. Their orders were to stop all ships from entering plague zones, but they had never encountered anyone crazy enough to fly towards certain death just to help strangers. They were trained to fight enemies, not people who claimed to want to help. The footage showed the human ships slowly moving past the much larger council warships. The battleships followed but did not fire, apparently too confused by the situation. To act. Captain Lee docked with a dying space station in the Vakari system, the professor said. Within hours, more human ships arrived. Then more. Soon there were dozens of human medical vessels in systems that the council had declared completely off limits. The display showed human medical teams in basic protective suits walking through plague-stricken facilities. Their equipment looked primitive, but they worked with incredible determination. They moved from patient to patient, taking notes on paper tablets and administering medicines with simple injection devices. Dr. Park Ji-woo and Dr. Kim So-young established the first treatment centers on dying worlds, Professor Xylith continued. They had no quantum computers to help them understand the plague, no biomanipulators to design cures, no advanced council technology at all. The students watched human doctors working in conditions that would have sent other species running. In terror, the humans looked small and fragile in their basic protective gear, but they never stopped working. What they did have, the professor said quietly, was something that the galaxy's advanced civilizations had apparently evolved beyond. Something that made no logical sense but changed everything. She paused dramatically, looking at each of her students. They had the absolute refusal to abandon people who needed help, regardless of whether those people had ever done anything for humanity in return. The holographic display shifted to show brain scans from different species across the galaxy. The images floated in the air like glowing maps of how different minds worked. Each species had beautiful organized patterns that showed millions of years of evolution and improvement. Professor Xylith pointed to the Vakari brain scan first. Your people, Crix, developed hive mind connections that let thousands of individuals think as one. Information processing that would take other species hours could be done in seconds. The scan showed elegant pathways of thought flowing between connected minds, creating patterns that looked like flowing rivers of light. Next came the Alterian scan. My people evolved crystal-based consciousness that can perform mathematical calculations instantly. We can solve problems that would challenge even the most advanced computers. The Alterian brain pattern looked like a perfect geometric design, with thoughts moving along precise crystal pathways in perfect harmony. The Silvani developed plant network intelligence that spans entire continents, the professor continued, showing Whisper of Leaves her people's scan. Your ancestors could share knowledge and wisdom across thousands of miles through root systems and chemical signals. Each brain scan was more impressive than the last. The Netherians had gaseous consciousness that could exist in multiple places at once. The rock people had mineral-based minds that could last for thousands of years without aging. Every species had evolved far beyond their primitive beginnings. Then Professor Xylith showed them a human brain scan. The students stared in confusion. The human brain pattern looked messy and chaotic compared to the others. Instead of clean, efficient pathways, human thoughts seemed to bounce around randomly. There were redundant systems everywhere, wasted space and emotional centers that interfered with logical thinking. Humans were evolutionary mistakes, the professor said bluntly. Their brains were cluttered with feelings that got in the way of clear thinking. They could not share thoughts like the Vrakari or calculate like the Altarians. Individual humans were isolated in their own minds, unable to access the collective knowledge that made other species so powerful. Stoneheart, the rock being student, rumbled with what might have been laughter. Professor, this explains why the Council rejected them. How could such primitive minds contribute anything useful to galactic civilization? That, Stoneheart, is exactly what everyone thought at the time, Professor Xylith replied. And that assumption nearly cost us everything. New footage appeared showing a human doctor working in a makeshift laboratory on a dying Netherian gas world. Dr. Cho Hansol worked alone, surrounded by basic equipment that looked like children's toys compared to advanced galactic medical technology. She used glass containers and simple machines, while the most sophisticated medical facilities in the galaxy stood empty and useless nearby. Dr. Cho made the breakthrough that saved the galaxy, the professor announced. Using primitive equipment and human intuition, she discovered what our quantum computers and genius scientists had missed. The display showed Dr. Cho's research notes, written by hand on paper, because human computers were too basic for complex calculations. Her handwriting was messy, with diagrams drawn in the margins and ideas crossed out and rewritten. The silent. Death was not a natural disease, Professor Xylith continued. It was an ancient biological weapon, created by a long-dead civilization as the ultimate military tool. It was designed to target one specific thing: evolutionary advancement. The revelation hit the students like a physical blow. Crix's antennae drooped as she understood the horrible truth. The weapon identified the most advanced features of each species' brain and attacked them directly, the professor explained. The more evolved and sophisticated a mind was, the more vulnerable it became. Our greatest achievements were killing us. Whisper of Leaves rustled in distress. So, our intelligence, our connections to each other, our advanced thinking, all of that made us perfect targets. Exactly, Professor Xylith confirmed. The Vrakari hive minds were destroyed because the weapon targeted their network connections. Altarian crystal consciousness was shattered because the weapon attacked their mathematical processing centers. Every species' greatest strength became their greatest weakness. The students sat in stunned silence as they realized how perfectly the ancient weapon had been designed. It would have wiped out every advanced civilization in the galaxy, leaving only primitive worlds behind. But humans, the professor continued, with their chaotic, inefficient, emotionally cluttered brains, were naturally resistant to the weapon. Their primitive neural patterns did not register as targets worthy of attack. New footage showed human volunteers lined up outside medical facilities on Earth. Thousands of people waited patiently in long lines, rolling up their sleeves as medical staff drew blood sample after blood sample. Dr. Cho discovered that human blood contained antibodies that could protect other species, Professor Xylith explained. But the process required massive amounts of human blood to create treatments for each alien species. The students watched in amazement as the lines of human volunteers stretched for miles. People brought folding chairs and waited for hours to donate blood. When they were told they could only donate once per week, many humans came back every week for months. Captain Yoon Jae-min organized the largest blood donation drive in human history, the professor continued. When the call went out that human blood could save alien lives, over 2 million humans volunteered immediately. They donated until they were weak and dizzy, then came back to donate more as soon as their bodies recovered. Crix clicked her mandibles in confusion. But Professor, humans barely knew us then. We had rejected them from the council. We called them primitives. Why would they hurt themselves to save people who had been mean to them? Professor Xylith looked at her students with something approaching wonder in her crystal eyes. Because, young Crix, humans possessed something that we had apparently lost in our evolution toward perfection, something that made no logical sense but proved more powerful than all our advanced technology combined. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. They cared about suffering regardless of who was suffering or whether they deserved to be helped. Professor Xylith's crystal features seemed to dim as she prepared to share the final part of the story. The holographic display changed to show official Galactic Council documents, clean, polished reports that looked very different from the raw footage the students had been watching. The silent death plague was officially contained and eliminated through the advanced research capabilities of the Hegemony Scientific Consortium, she read from the official record in a flat, emotionless voice. Minimal casualties occurred due to efficient quarantine procedures and rapid deployment of council-developed medical treatments. The students stared at the official text floating in the air. The words were completely different from everything they had just learned. There was no mention of humans anywhere in the document, no record of the blood donations or the brave medical ships that had broken through quarantine zones. According to official Galactic Council history, Professor Xylith continued, humanity provided minor logistical support and basic medical assistance. During the crisis, their role was classified as limited but appreciated. Whisper of Leaves rustled with anger, her bark making sharp, cracking sounds. Professor, that is a lie. Humans saved everyone. Why would the Council hide the truth? Keep listening, young one, and you will understand, the professor replied sadly. New footage appeared showing Earth after the plague years. The planet looked tired and worn down. Human hospitals were overflowing with people who had donated so much blood that their health had been permanently damaged. The volunteers who had given their blood to save alien lives were now suffering from weakness, anemia, and other complications. The massive blood donation campaigns took a terrible toll on humanity, Professor Xylith explained. Millions of humans suffered long-term health problems because they had given too much of their own life force to save strangers. Their primitive medical technology could not fully repair the damage. The display showed human medical ships limping back to Earth, their hulls scarred and patched from running council blockades. Many ships never made it home at all. They had been destroyed by council forces or had broken down in deep space while carrying medicine to plague worlds. Captain Lee Minho, the first human to break quarantine, died at age 47 from complications related to experimental plague treatments, the professor said quietly. Dr. Park Ji-woo died at 34. Dr. Kim So-young lived only to age 29. Most of the humans who helped develop the cure died young because they had tested dangerous medicines on themselves when no one else would volunteer. The students listened in growing horror as Professor Xylith read name after name of human heroes who had died young. These people could have lived long, safe lives on their homeworld, but they had chosen to risk everything to save aliens they had never met. After the plague ended, the Galactic Council faced a serious problem, the professor continued. How could they maintain their authority and prestige if everyone knew that their greatest crisis had been solved not by advanced civilization, but by primitive compassion? The display showed council meetings from after the plague. The chamber was filled with representatives from the most powerful species in the galaxy, all discussing what to do about the human situation. The council's solution was simple and effective, Professor Xylith said, her voice becoming bitter. They rewrote history. Official records were changed, classified documents were sealed, and a new version of events was created that gave credit to council science and leadership. Crix's mandibles clicked with shame. But Professor, what about the humans? What did they get for saving the galaxy? Humanity was rewarded with limited trade agreements and probationary membership in the Galactic Council, the professor answered. They were given the status of a minor species with restricted voting rights. They remained second-class citizens in the very galaxy they had saved. The holographic display showed modern Earth, still a small, struggling world with limited resources. Human ships were still patched and outdated, compared to the gleaming vessels of other species. Human colonies were few and poorly funded. Despite having saved galactic civilization, humanity remained on the bottom of the social hierarchy. Your families know the truth, Professor Zillith said, looking directly at each of her students. The generation that lived through the plague. Years remembers the human medical ships arriving when everyone else had given up hope. They remember the human doctors who stayed to help even when it meant certain death. They remember the human blood that flowed through their veins and saved their lives. Stoneheart rumbled uneasily. Then why did no one tell us? Why did our parents and grandparents keep this secret? Because they were asked to, the professor replied. The council decided that younger generations should not learn the truth. They believed it would create too much confusion and challenge the established order. Your families were told that keeping the secret was necessary for galactic stability. The classroom filled with the sounds of alien weeping. Crix's mandibles produced a clicking rhythm that meant deep sorrow among her people. Whisper of leaves rustled like a forest in a storm. The Netherian students' gaseous forms pulsed with colors that showed their emotional pain. You now face a choice, Professor Zylith said as she began to pack up her teaching materials. You can accept the comfortable official version of history that makes your species look wise and advanced. Or you can seek out the truth that your own families have hidden from you. She looked around the room one final time, her crystal eyes reflecting the pain and confusion on her students' faces. Class is over. I suggest you contact your home worlds immediately. Ask your elders about the humans who came when the lights went out across the galaxy. Ask them about the primitive species that refused to let advanced civilizations die alone. Ask them why they never told you that the galaxy's greatest heroes were the ones everyone called too backward to matter. The students left the classroom, in silence, many heading straight to the communication centers to call their families. The lesson was finished, but their real education was just beginning.